underlying dialectic they're trying to inject here, because the narrative being spun now supports the division, supports the strife, supports the controversy. Admitting the truth, putting this in perspective, would change the whole thing, and they would lose that driving engine. And that's why they will not have that honest conversation they talk about all the time, because it would destroy the narrative. And that's what I wanted to examine, is how, if you look going all the way back 50 or 60 years, the same faces or their descendants keep popping up behind the scenes. And when you begin to put the network connections together, then you understand something different is afoot. Jim Simpson's my guest right now. He wrote an article, Reds Exploiting Blacks, The Roots of Black Lives Matter, for AIM.org. Now, you mentioned several different organizations here, and I want to show how a relatively few number of organizations, mostly unfamiliar to most Americans, are actually driving any one of these various so-called spontaneous eruptions of protest or whatever. You identified the one you just did, Freedom Road Socialist Organizations, and you said that's one of the four largest of the really what I call the Marxist left groups in the country. The other would be obviously Communist Party USA, CPUSA,
Yep.
Democratic Socialists of America, and the Committees of Correspondence for Democracy and Socialism. They always work the word democracy in there, don't they?
Yeah, they do. It's such a misnomer. I mean, it's just like the term direct democracy. Don't you love that term? Direct democracy is Occupy Wall Street violence. Direct democracy is what we saw on the streets of Egypt during the Arab Spring, when a few 100,000 people violently protested long enough to help insinuate the Muslim Brotherhood into power. Fortunately, Egypt had the presence of mind to throw them out of power, and the military took over. Not a perfect turn of events, but infinitely better than having the Muslim Brotherhood in charge. But that's a perfect example of direct democracy. The other one is Democratic Socialists of America. They're not democratic in the least. They are hardcore Trotskyite communists.
Now, this is interesting, because we have to say, when you talk about, we have the dialectical process, the issue is never the issue, it's always the revolution, and whatever they can seize upon at any moment to create the dialectical tension to move us towards that, that's fine. What's the ultimate goal? And then we have some implications in that. So what's their ultimate goal?
Well, like I say, the ultimate goal is to undermine this country to the point where it is so weak and so disjointed that they can assume power.
But Jim, what do they want in power? Once they get into power, is there a mind there? Are they creating a utopia? Because I think a lot of the hangers-on to these groups naively believe they're headed towards some kind of a utopia.
Well, that's the great dodge of communism, if you will. Communism and socialism have survived for over 100 years by misrepresenting themselves. Communism attempts to pass itself off as a means for the oppressed of the earth to finally obtain justice. And that's all we hear about, social justice. Social justice is just another word for communism. But in fact, communism is nothing more than a very clever game plan for seizing and holding power. And all leaders of all communist nations have proven that fact beyond a shadow of a doubt. There's not a single communist country in the world that is not ruled by an individual or a family or a small cabal of people who become impossibly wealthy at the expense of the entire society. And because it is such an outrageous kleptocracy, they are required to maintain a pervasive, deadly, brutal, secret police apparatus to protect them from the people who despise them and to destroy opponents. And that's true in Cuba, that's true in Russia, that's true in China, that's true in any communist country. We're seeing it happening now as Venezuela transforms into a genuine communist country where people are starving in the streets and property is being confiscated and people with any kind of power and influence are being disappeared. You know, a lot of people haven't heard that way of presenting what communism and socialism are. And socialism, by the way, is just communism on the installment plan. But John Roche, who was himself a socialist, he was one of the founders of the Americans for Democratic Action, and he was an advisor to both Kennedy and Johnson. He has said that communism is not so much an ideology for freeing the oppressed of the earth as it is a new code for a new form of mafia interested in nothing more than obtaining power and wealth. And that's exactly what it is. It's a new form of mafia that's found a much more innovative way than the standard mafia to get the wealth and the power that it wants.
So that's why, say in the case of Cuba, the ideologues who are the hangers-on at the level where like Castro was, as soon as they consolidate power, they have to be done away with because they suddenly realize they're not going to get what they were promised.
Oh, yeah, no. And the ideologues are really kind of the biggest pains in the neck. You know, they line the revolution boulevards of communist countries all over the world, and their memory serves the regimes much more than the actual people did. So, for example, you know, we have Che Guevara. You know, Che Guevara has this romantic image in the mind of the American left. He's a hero of the people of Hollywood leftists, and he was a man who never bathed. He smelled bad. He raped women. He enjoyed killing young boys. He enjoyed executing people in prison, especially young men and boys. He was a coward in battle, and he was put in charge of cultural affairs in the early Castro regime, and he outlawed beer drinking and loud music. And he was so obnoxious and such a intolerable scold that Castro sent him down to Bolivia just to get rid of him. And it's alleged that his KGB girlfriend is the one who actually set him up. So he's been a much better communist in death than he ever was in life, and he has served to maintain the legend of, you know, this romantic vision of communism that has nothing to do with the reality in death that he could not sustain while he was living.
Now, we're going out for a news break right now. Jim Simpson's my guest right now. He is an economist, businessman, and writer for Accuracy in Media, American Thinker, Washington Times, and WorldNet Daily. And you can find Accuracy in Media at aim.org. Now we've identified the base organizations here, and the base organizations tend to be those underneath that drive all of these so-called spontaneous outbreaks that drive and actually fund in many cases. The next, sandwiched in between them, is another tier of organizations that act as aids to that. And then there's another layer of organizations that support it that aren't necessarily directly involved with it but get duped by it. I hope you're following all of this because this is how this thing is layered in terms of its functionality. We'd like you to like us on Facebook, and we do have a special Facebook page, Praying for Persecuted Christians. And don't forget, you can hear our Section 6 Intelligence Brief online for all of our registered users at steelonsteel.com. I'm John Leffler, and the program is Steel on Steel. We'll see you right after the break. You know, I wanted to spend a lot of time on the subject we have been discussing today with my guest, Jim Simpson. Welcome back to Steel on Steel for the second hour of the program, because you really need to understand how what I call the idealistic, the progressive secular elites, the hardcore Marxist, neo-Marxists, have been functioning in this country since the days of the Flower Child movement in the 1960s. That all of a sudden, when one of these, quote, spontaneous movements erupts, if you really look, faces are the same or their ideological ancestors for these supposed spontaneous type of events. Remember, the issue is never the issue. The ultimate outcome is the outcome of the revolution. And they will add an issue as needed and drop an issue like a hot potato if it no longer serves their goals. And that's why suddenly some people, look at how upset the Bernie Sanders people are, they discovered they've really been had in the midst of all this. Well, funny that. That's the way it really works. And everyone in any kind of a socialist revolution has discovered that socialist revolutions eat their own children first. And yet, generation after generation, because the battle cry of socialism and social justice and all of these slogan words are always the issue of driving the wedge to create the dialectic to move people to get them to go along. Now, the only mortal sin, remember, in the dialectic is to expose the dialectic for what it is and to refuse to go along with it. Because then all of a sudden they can't set the rules for the game. Then they go crazy. Jim Simpson's my guest. If you go back to Black Lives Matter in 2013, began with a hashtag, Black Lives Matter, after George Zimmerman was acquitted in the Trayvon Martin killing. Now, remember, Mr. Zimmerman was an Hispanic. But lo and behold, we had to make sure he was called by the media a white Hispanic. That word white had to go in there because the narrative doesn't allow for racial tensions between subgroups. So the word white had to go in there. And then suddenly it was a spontaneous movement, and we began to see radical leftist activists, it was theoretically founded by these, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi. They all claim credit for the slogan and hashtag. Who are they? Well, they work for front groups of the Freedom Road Socialist Organization. It's one of those 4 largest radical left organizations in the country. The others, they're partners in crime, Communist Party USA, Democratic Socialists of America, and Committees of Correspondence for Democracy and Socialism. Now, what I want to do, those are the bedrock, because you have multiple layers here. You have the real driver and shaker organizations that seize upon any issue. They'll look at an issue that's developing, seize it, come up with something supposedly spontaneous. Into that, a whole big crowd of gullible, uninformed people, or people who may be well-meaning, they jump on the bandwagon, not aware who these other people are that are driving it. There's a second tier of organizations, which is what I want to get to next. And then the third tier are the people they either extort or cajole into giving them money in order to keep the whole cause going. But as far as the baseline crowd that drives this and the baseline money sources, it's always the same faces. The George Soroses of the world always pop right up. Jim, now what I want to do is go to the second level of organization here. Unless you understand it, you're going to get taken. Churches get taken by this stuff. I can't tell you how much. I would wager one of those is the hate monitoring organization, the Southern Poverty Law Center.
Yeah, they find it among conservatives. I honor their list of haters, many of us do. And it is the same tactic that has been used by the left since the left first made an appearance on the world stage. It is to discredit your enemy. And let me just get this quote from Lenin because it's perfect. We can and must write in a language which sows among the masses hate, revulsion, and scorn toward those who disagree with us. That's what Lenin said. And then Herbert Marcuse, the man who mentored Angela Davis, came up with a concept called partisan tolerance, where he believed that the left would never get an honest hearing in the racist, imperialist, capitalist United States. So the only way for them to be given a fair hearing in the court of public opinion is to suppress all voices that oppose them. What we have that now is Saul Alinsky, who was really the latecomer to put this entire strategy into practice, who advocates isolating and polarizing and then defaming anyone who disagrees with them. But he's just the endpoint in a long tradition of defamation that the left has always used against its enemies. And the whole idea is to just discredit them. Plus, it's a form of psychological terrorism, because if you think about it, CNN, NBC, ABC, CBS, New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, all calling somebody like me a racist or a sexist or something like that, has an effect that people begin to think, well, gee, maybe that's true. They can't all be wrong. And then anybody who I'm associated with suddenly gets branded with that same suspicion, and people are afraid of that. People don't want to lose their jobs. They don't want to be associated with anybody who's a racist. They don't want to be called racist. There are very clear reasons why people are afraid of those things. And so that's what they're really doing. They are defaming people.